I'd just like to begin by acknowledging that we're on Ngunnawal country and that sovereignty over this country was never ceded. And I want to pay my respects to Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples who have lived in, studied and cared for these lands for tens of thousands of years and who maintain an enduring kinship with the animals, plants and ecosystems that make up this precious place that we call home. I acknowledge that reconciliation is still ongoing and extend my respects to First Nations people joining us today. So it's with great pleasure as the head of sociology to start off this quick introduction before I pass over to my esteemed colleague Helen to introduce our amazing speaker tonight. We've just been through our first school review just very recently, and we came through it very well, I think. And one of the things that review asked us to do was really reflect on our discipline and what we do at ANU and what makes us unique and distinctive on the world stage. And this topic area that we're going to be having this amazing lecture tonight is one of our key nodes that we've set up called Embodiment, Gender and Health, which is actually convened by Professor Celia Roberts, who's the person responsible for bringing this amazing speaker, Karen Throsby from Leeds, to ANU. And this node comprises world-leading scholars who focus their work on the body, subjectivity and health nexus. And we actually have quite a few of them, most of them in the room with us tonight, which is great, and also online. And we have a specific focus in this research node on addictions, distress, reproduction, and the queering and decolonization of embodiment and subjectivity. We have Celia Roberts, Melinda Cooper, Helen Keane, Mary Lou Rasmussen, Catherine Walby, Catherine Carroll, Maria Hines, Alistair Ott, and Tao Fan, all as key members of this group. And this is a group that we see as really kind of having a real undisciplining aspect to it, where we're looking to pull in members across the university into this node that are doing work on these kinds of areas. And so it's really exciting to have this first event that this node is kind of hosting. And has some really exciting projects on it. So really excited to see where this all goes and to have you all here tonight to talk about this extremely interesting issue. And I'll pass over to Helen to
Thank you. It's my great pleasure to introduce Karen Throsby, who is a visiting fellow, SSS visiting fellow, Research School of Social Sciences visiting fellow in sociology. Karen is a professor of gender studies, and she's also the head of the School of Sociology and Social Policy at Leeds University, the University of Leeds, and that's a really big school. So we're super lucky that we've managed to drag her away from those duties to join us here. Karen's research focuses on the intersections of gender, technology, the body and health, and she's explored these issues in relation to things like reproductive technology, surgical weight management, and endurance swimming, and most recently, the social life of sugar, which is partly what we're going to hear about tonight. She's the author of many, many things, but I'm just going to mention 3 books, Sugar Rush, Science, Politics, and the Demonization of Fatness, the most recent work. When IVF Fails, Feminism, Infertility, and the Negotiation of Normality, which I think is the earliest book, yeah. And Immersion, Marathon Swimming, Embodiment and Identity, which is the middle book. And I mention it last because I do have to say, I think you are probably the first RSSS visiting fellow who has swum the English Channel. So this is just to note that Karen is a woman of diverse and remarkable talents, and we're very much looking forward to your talk tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much for those kind introductions. I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from the Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. Thank you very much for coming today. It's a privilege to be here, specifically here, speaking at this event, but it's also a privilege to be here as a visiting fellow and as an escaping head of school who's been let out for a few weeks. It's just lovely to be here and to do something different and think about research and meet lots of old friends and new friends as well. So thank you for coming. So sugar. So in the early 2010s, sugar supplanted dietary fat as the public health enemy #1, and it became the subject of a proliferating raft of newspaper articles, popular science books, self-help guides, national and international policies, all urging us to give up the white stuff. As Public Health England declared in the opening line of its 2015 paper on sugar reduction, we are, oh, sorry, no, that's not right. We are eating too much sugar and it's bad for our health. Sugar reduction, we are repeatedly promised, is a win-win which will boost individual well-being, reduce healthcare costs, and protect the NHS if only people would play their part. And so my work on sugar has been driven by the desire to think critically about this seemingly self-evident claim and to think about what's excluded or made invisible by this appeal to consensus. One of the defining features of the attack on sugar is its framing as hidden in our food and in our bodies. This is exemplified by a short animation released by Change for Life, which is a public health organisation funded by the NHS, in January 2019 to launch its Smart Swaps campaign. Oh, no, stop. There we go. In the film, angry cubes of sugar emerge from everyday store-cupboard food packaging and run amok in the family kitchen to a horror soundtrack. Two children take cover from the onslaught behind their father, who desperately tries to fend off the cubes by swatting at them with a frying pan, until the day is saved. Oh, why is it doing that? Okay. Until the day is saved by the appearance of their mother, triumphantly brandishing 2 bags of shopping. A child's voice tells us now mum's got an easy way to cut back on sugar with lower sugar swaps on the things we eat every day. Empowered by her smart swap, she whistles to the rampaging cubes who run obediently out the back door. An adult female voiceover at the end of the film urges, make a swap when you next shop. Although it opens with a brief warning about the dangers of eating too much sugar, the film's focus is really on how it gets into our diets, beginning from a core feature of sugar's contemporary demonization, that it's not only hidden, but that it actively hides. It's an enemy that seeps unseen through the porous boundaries of the home and of our bodies, wreaking havoc as it goes. Consequently, the problem of sugar can't be resolved simply by choosing to stop consuming it. You have to be able to find it first. The work of giving up sugar, then, is also the work of rooting it out. And this is a process that requires instruction. We are surrounded by information about how to eat, live, sleep, exercise in the name of health. And these life lessons aren't confined to the classroom or to the clinic, but circulate across social, cultural, economic, political, and public health domains. These are never purely informational, but instead aim to cultivate the good bio-citizen. That is, a citizen whose primary obligation is to take responsibility for their own physical well-being and make the right choices informed by health expertise. As such, these biopedagogies constitute lessons not only in what to eat or how much to exercise, but are also run through with virtue discourses which establish certain behaviours and qualities as worthy and desirable, and which distinguish the good bio-citizen from the failing one. The Smart Swaps campaign then not only offers information about how to reduce a family's sugar consumption, but is also heavily laden with the normative expectation of behaviour change, and particularly for women, which I'm going to come back to. So my talk today focuses on 2 aspects of these biopedagogies of sugar reduction. The first part explores what I've called the hidden sugar shock genre of newspaper reporting, the use of staged exposés to shock readers into realization and action. And the second looks at the burgeoning genre of self-help texts, which pick up where the shock stories leave off, offering to guide readers expertly through the why and how of relinquishing sugar. I want to argue that the readiness to do the work of giving up sugar becomes a marker of the disciplined individual who's willing and able to take control of their life and their body, and who can't be seduced by false pleasures. Our relationship to sugar, then, has been rendered a fundamental statement of who we are. Before I get into that, I want to just briefly introduce the research on which the paper is based, and which was published in 23. I'm going to try this again, see what happens. There we go. Which was published in 2023 in my book, in this new book, Sugar Rush, Science, Politics, and the Demonization of Fatness. And the research for this was very generously funded by the Liberating Trust, which I'm very grateful for. The book, when it came out last summer, the summer before in 23, was reviewed in the Sunday Times, not favourably. And, and I was described as, I was described as both angry and vacuous. Which I wear as a badge of honour from the Sunday Times. This book was actually a departure from what I'd been doing previously, where I'd done a lot of work using interviews, using ethnography, using autoethnography. And this was a move towards a much more text-based analysis of media representations and so on. So, but it's a continuation of my interest in bodies and kind of normative expectations of bodily change and so on, but with a kind of a new move towards a slightly different methodology. So the research started with a search of newspaper coverage of sugar, originally from 2000 to 2018, and later extended to October 2020, when I was trying to capture some of the anti-obesity sentiment that kind of bubbled up at the start of the pandemic. So I searched the archives of 9 UK newspapers, including tabloids and broadsheets from across the political spectrum, for articles of over 500 words that had sugar in the headline, to try and get some substantive reporting. I filtered these manually to remove irrelevant articles, so there was a surprising number of references to Allen sugar, as well as recipes and metaphorical uses of sugar that often come up in business pages, like a spoonful of sugar, sweetening the deal, things like that. So this was the result of that first big sweep. And as you can see, even though what came to be called the war on obesity dates from the turn of the millennium, it's not until 2012, 2013 that sugar's rise to prominence takes off. And I'm not going to talk about this in my talk specifically, but if we can talk about it afterwards, about why I think that is and why it happened then, but also what happens after the drop-off, what happens after 2020, 21. Based on this pattern, I selected as a final data set to work with January 2013 through to October 2020, and it's a total of 556 papers. And as you can see, it's quite unevenly spread with very different kinds of reporting between different newspapers. So then to this core data set, I added research papers, press releases, science, popular science, websites, autobiographies, TV shows, documentaries, lifestyle guides, policy documents, anything I could get my hands on that was about sugar and about the crisis of sugar. And this is the collective material that I used to write Sugar Rush. But before I move on, I just want to say a few words about some of the challenges of writing critically on this topic, and to try and perhaps preempt some of the most common challenges that I encounter when I talk about the work. So there are two kind of key responses. And the first is the sugar confession, where people offer up unprompted confessions of their own helplessness in the face of sugary foods, describing themselves as addicts or as having a sweet tooth. At events where I've presented my research, people apologize to me for eating biscuits or cakes in front of me and promise to go to the gym later or do better tomorrow. In these moments of heightened food anxiety, my own consumption then comes under scrutiny. As a vegan, I'm rarely able to eat the sweet food at events, but where I'm known as someone working on sugar, my non-consumption is repeatedly read as sugar avoidance, with the suspicion that I'm somehow hypocritically limiting my own sugar consumption while writing critically about those advocating sugar reduction. It's an assumption that's quite difficult to refute without then opening up the fresh can of worms that is veganism. But this kind of mundane surveillance of the self and the others in relation to sugar, I think, is a really useful reminder of the everyday struggles with food that many people, and particularly women, experience, and of the easy way in which guilt, shame, and worry about food and bodies trickle into everyday conversations and social interactions. And sugar has become a lightning rod for this kind of talk. And in the book, I call it Sugar Talk. The second response is the alarmed question, but you're not defending sugar, are you? Or another manifestation of the same impulse, but it's bad for you, isn't it? In this way, I find myself constantly pressed to concede the wrongness of sugar in exchange for engagement with my more critical analysis of sugar's fraught social life. I find this insistence fascinating, that we must all agree that it's bad before we can even begin to talk about the inequalities entrenched in such a claim. Within the familiar binary of framing food as either good or bad, asking critical questions about the attack on sugar is constantly misunderstood as me coming to its defense. And my refusal to join the chorus of voices denouncing sugar risks placing me in dangerous alignment with the forces of big sugar. I'm asked repeatedly, for example, if Sugar Rush was funded by the sugar industry. It's an attempt to discredit, which fundamentally misunderstands my argument, as well as misunderstanding the funding landscape, where even if I wanted it, which I don't, money is definitely not flowing from the food industry to a feminist critical food and fat studies scholar. The biggest challenge then in writing the book has been to find a language to express critique in a context where the terms of the debate are firmly entrenched in ways that forestall that critique before it's even started. If I were to concede the terms of the debate, I would argue that as much as any food can be meaningfully categorized as good or bad, sugar is not especially helpful, but that approaches that measure food by its nutrient properties alone cannot begin to capture food's social meanings and values. Eating is never just swallowing and metabolizing food. It's also a means of experiencing pleasure, sociality, love, comfort, community, and care. I think of the walnut whip. My grandmother bought me and my brother one of these every Friday throughout my childhood. A nutrient-focused evaluation of the walnut whip cannot begin to capture the emotions and memories that I experience when I see one, even though I haven't eaten one for years. The dislocation of sugar from the social world in which it is consumed is a core problem which the book aims to address. So let's move on now to think about one of the key mechanisms through which dietary sugar is constructed as hidden or hiding. And this is the hidden sugar shock story. One of the characteristics of sugar as a foodstuff is that it's rarely consumed on its own, and it's more commonly combined with other foods. It acts as a sweetener, a preservative, or it provides palatable texture. Home consumption of store cupboard granulated sugar, for example, the kind of thing you'd use in baking or you'd put in tea, that receives relatively little attention from anti-sugar campaigns. Instead, the primary focus of the attack on sugar is processed foods to which added sugar is integral, but not self-evidently visible. The hidden sugar shock story is a staged expose of this unseen sugar. In the period covered by this research, hidden sugar shock stories, primarily instigated by the UK campaigning organisation Action on Sugar, which was founded in 2014, covered an array of obviously sweet foods, including energy drinks, coffee shop cakes, chocolate nut spreads, muffins, milkshakes, waffles, and Christmas hot drinks. At first glance, these might seem like unlikely targets for stories about hidden sugar, given that they're so obviously sugary. But they dominate the hidden sugar shock genre, with the shock value lying not in the presence of sugar per se, but from its unexpectedly high quantities. And this makes for really impactful headlines, this kind of thing. This is exemplified by a campaign launched by Action on Sugar in November 2018 against high sugar milkshakes. Based on a survey of out-of-home and supermarket shakes, Action on Sugar grabbed media attention by offering up a spectacular worst offender, the freak shake. Freak shakes are concoctions of milkshake, ice cream, sweets, cookies, and cakes, or what the Sun newspaper described in its second-day coverage as a mega milkshake mashup of a drink and a pudding. The most extravagant freak shakes contain well over 1,000 calories and over 30 teaspoons of sugar, when the recommended daily sort of upper limit is 7 teaspoons. And there's a whole thing that you could say about how that was arrived at, but that's the standard that we're using. The campaign and its subsequent media coverage focused on products sold by the UK Harvester and Toby Carvery chains, both of which cater to a working class demographic. The day after the campaign launched to keep the story alive, Action on Sugar tweeted that daily consumption of freak shakes by children would cause tooth decay and obesity, but they offered no evidence at all about how frequently these are consumed or by whom. So, for example, at well over £5 per shake, it's highly unlikely that children are consuming these daily on the way home from school. Furthermore, Action on Sugar's hyperventilating horror can't account for the sociality of eating, the possibility that friends might club together with multiple spoons to share one of these as a kind of fun, sociable treat. I said this at an event where there was a representative of Action on Sugar, and basically he said that I was lacking a sense of humour and that it was for fun, okay, which obviously is a very classic way of silencing critique as well. But regardless of whether this campaign was intended seriously or whether it was simply a piece of headline-grabbing fun, the underlying message is still disturbingly clear that working-class people are dietarily incontinent in the face of sugary food. And as such, they have to be protected from themselves, in this case by banning the most excessive, which they were calling to ban freak shakes. And then they wanted to place a 300-calorie limit on all other shakes that were sold. And for me, so the we of the Public Health England, we are eating too much sugar. What I'm kind of been trying to get at in the book is that this masks the unevenness in terms of where and with whom the problem is seen as lying. Just as a war on obesity inevitably becomes a war on those categorized as obese, when we make enemies of particular foods, we make enemies of the people presumed to eat those foods, with hierarchies of taste setting up class distinctions between us and them. A second strand of hidden sugar shock stories comes in the form of what I've called the mortified mother genre of news reporting, where family sugar consumption is calculated, and then mothers are subject to evaluation and correction by an expert. And it's this kind of story, it's a sort of tabloid favorite, because you can just do them endlessly. For example, in February 2017, and this is from the article on the right from The Sun, mother of three, Gemma, responded to a nutritionist's evaluation of her children's daily diet. And I won't read this out loud, I'll let you read it, but basically what you can see, she starts to pick apart all of the things that she's given the children and correct and be corrected about what she should have done instead. And then she's doing all this extra work of gathering information and totting everything up. So unlike the dramatic excess of the freak shake, the impact of the mortified mother story lies in the shock of accumulation, with small quantities of hidden added sugar, often in savoury foods, mounting up unseen in the course of the day. And while the stories about obviously sugary foods frequently play on class assumptions of incontinent consumption and instant gratification, as with the freak shakes, these stories rest on correctable error, seething maternal guilt, and the unseen work of women. For the reformed Gemma, sugar reduction generates significant additional domestic labour, cooking from scratch, reading nutritional information, and calculating and recording consumption by the teaspoon and the gram for every family member. And a lot of these stories also have additional advice to women about how they can reduce sugar for their families secretly, particularly in relation to male partners, so that they're not kind of inconvenienced by it or don't notice it. But it's a way of getting them healthier without them having to engage with the project. This is cast as part of her maternal duties and wifely duties, and therefore as pleasurable, being a good mother, acquiring new colouring skills, etc. So throughout the project and across every single data source that I collected, I never once saw a similar article targeting fathers or including the redistribution of the labour of sugar reduction as part of the copious advice that was given. However, even for those mothers most successfully managing their family's sugar intake, the possibility of maternal failure remains. For example, the final case in the same article, where we meet Gemma, focuses on mother of two and family therapist Zariah. Unusually, nutritional therapist Claudia can barely find fault with the family's diet, which is packed with fresh fruit and vegetables and includes hardly any sugar or processed foods. However, Zariah's successors have revealed new opportunities to fail. And Claudia warns, we need it for energy, so we shouldn't cut it out. And the other thing is, if you're too strict or food focused, it can make children rebel or lead to eating disorders. So Zariah, of course, takes this warning to heart. And she says, I think she might have a point. It might make them want it because they can't have it. And I'd hate for it to become an issue, so I'll make sure they get the odd sweet treat. This highlights the tension that runs through dietary advice in general and advice about sugar in particular, that we should meet the moral requirement to maintain rigorous and detailed scrutiny of our sugar consumption whilst avoiding being too strict or obsessive and creating collateral problems of health and well-being. This tension is created by the centralizing of hidden sugar as the problem to be solved. And as in relation to so many food-related questions, the circle is squared by maternal labour. It's Zariah who absorbs the intense moral and practical demands of sugar reduction in order to create a balanced environment for others. So while men dominate the anti-sugar domain as the voices of authority, particularly in the popular science domain, it's women who are the movement's unspoken workforces. They're brought sharply into focus when they come up short, but become invisible as food workers through the recasting of work as gendered leisure. As such, my point here is not that women's work is simply hidden, but that it's been naturalized into invisibility. This cultivates a sense of ease and simplicity around sugar reduction that raises the stakes for those who are seen as not complying. The accusatory question hangs in the air. Where it's more pleasure than work, what kind of mother wouldn't do it? But these sugar shock stories are just the beginning. And particularly for those who want to relinquish added sugar entirely from their diets, rather than just reduce it, the process is framed as requiring extensive work on the self. As part of the Sugar Rush project, I focused on 9 books, all broadly within the self-help genre, and they were all top sellers during the period of the study, and most of them were reviewed in the newspaper coverage that I looked at. So we've got a range of books. So this includes books within the kind of broadly the wellness genre, sort of quite glossy, beautiful books, very highly programmatic texts that demand step-by-step obedience, textually dense accounts that present detailed popular science-informed descriptions of the danger of sugar as a sort of mode of persuasion, and then autobiographical accounts by authors who document their own motivations, struggles, and triumphs. And they're always quite funny, and they're always kind of self-deprecating, but they're always to didactic effect. Central to the project of giving up sugar is simplicity, with authors boasting of programs without gimmicks or special diets, of not having to count points or calories, of incorporating no shakes, no pills, no off-limits food groups. They all say without exception, this is not a diet. Okay, diets are a site of failure. Australian anti-sugar autodidact and campaigner David Gillespie, for example, claims that the Sweet Poison Quit Plan is not a diet book with simple presumptions and complex rules. It's an anti-diet book with detailed evidence, but simple rules. And this is encapsulated for him in what he calls his super rule. Don't eat sugar. And you've got a tension here between this insistence on simplicity and then the need for a book-length exposition about how to manage it. This appeal to simplicity is shored up with bullet-pointed and numbered lists of rules or steps which simultaneously invoke obedience and choice. For example, in an echo of the 12-step recovery programs like AA, and in line with his heavily structured and trademarked Easy Way system, Alan Carr's plan is comprised of 12 key instructions, the first of which is to follow the instructions. In many cases, the rules or steps are impossible to distinguish from generic dietary advice that they emphatically distance themselves from. This is not a diet, but then the advice is almost exactly the same. And they're trying to distinguish themselves from each other because they have to have a marketable product, but they're using the same, they're using the same very generic advice. Things like only eating when you're hungry, getting enough sleep, drinking lots of water, exercising, and avoiding simple carbohydrates. Most lists also include some form of attitudinal or emotional management. For example, Gillespie's first rule is to have the right attitude, and Dan DeFigio instructs readers to avoid boredom. But for all their mundanity, the liberation that they offer is spectacular. And all the self-help guides promise a dietary reset that aims to permanently break what they see as sugar's hold on the body. So take this promise from David Gillespie. This is right at the front of the book, where he says, it won't be fun. Starting is the half the battle. Hold the line, no moderation. You've stopped poisoning yourself. If you can just get past the next few weeks of danger, you'll enjoy the health sugar has sucked from your life to date. And then all of a sudden, your desire for sugar will vanish. I know it will sound strange, but it just goes bang. These promises rest on an understanding of sugar, not simply as a source of empty calories, but as toxic in its own right, creating metabolic devastation in ways that are not immediately visible from the outside or from the harms that are happening inside the body. So as flamboyant anti-sugar author Robert Lustig warns menacingly to people who are slim, but still consuming sugar, you think you are safe, you're so screwed, you don't even know it. Once this reset has been achieved, readers are promised the unsustainable control that dieting demands through the exercise of willpower will no longer be necessary, and this is the liberation. This reproduces the central pillar of the anti-sugar self-help domain, that liberation from sugar is a matter of personal choice and commitment. Fundamental to these exhortations to choice and responsibility is the conviction that below the chaos of sugar's metabolic disruptions, there is a real self, hidden beneath the devastations of sugar, whose appetites are naturally oriented towards healthful, sugar-free consumption. Readers are urged to reclaim this true self by undertaking time-limited sugar-free challenges that will, variously described as, wipe the slate clean, reset your fullness signal, establish a clean canvas. These exhortations presume the latent presence of an authentically pristine body, uncontaminated by modernity, that's robustly healthy, and whose imagined appetites and dietary needs are universal and predictable. And this first stage of wiping the slate clean is the primary site of struggle in the books. But once the body has reset, the rewards flow, offering the tantalizing dietary fantasy of being able to eat whatever you want, because you will only want to eat good foods. As Gillespie promises, once your sugar addiction is broken, a triple layer chocolate cake sitting next to your cuppa will not be the remotest bit tempting. It's a model that ensures the erasure of social, economic, or cultural influences on food choice, which are all sublimated to these natural biological drives. But even so, the classed presumptions underpinning these discourses of restoration and liberation seep through. So, for example, Eve Schau describes her experiences of eating a cookie or some chocolate once her year was over. And so she said she gets this funny sensation in her mouth, like she'd just drunk pure syrup. And then a few minutes pass and I'd feel a small headachy feeling creeping around the base of my brain, followed by a weird energizing feeling, a sugar buzz, if you will. And you can see the language of drugs is there in terms of how this is being framed. Sugar-heavy foods figure here not as without taste, but as having a blunt excess of taste. And in this way, the anticipated changes in taste after quitting sugar mark a transition to becoming tasteful, exposing the classed foundations of a sugar-free life. For example, after her no-sugar year, Schaub explains her enjoyment of, quote, things with a much subtler sweetness, declaring proudly that, quote, sodas, ice cream sundaes, carnival cotton candy all now strike me as slightly gross. And I mean, it's no coincidence the things that she's chosen there. For Gillespie, this transformation in taste literally renders him a connoisseur, boasting excitedly that he could now tell between Cabernet Sauvignon and Shiraz, whereas it all just tasted the same before. The consumption of sugary, heavily processed foods then is in poor taste, becoming, like the freak shakes, a marker of uncontained, thoughtless eating with crude, excessive, effortless sweetness, signaling a lack of refinement and impatience for pleasure. Conversely, the sugar-free consumer is discerning, in search of subtle and exotic taste experiences to be enjoyed slowly and from quality food. This class transformation exemplifies the way in which giving up sugar makes a positive claim about who you are. In this case, a responsible, tasteful, middle-class subject who is reaping the just rewards of their bodily discipline. In line with the expansive promises of the self-help genre more generally, these transformations in appetite control and tasteful moderation are just the beginning of the promised freedoms and pleasures of a life without sugar. Set against a Wonder Woman cartoon figure, Elsa Jones claims that by the end of her 10-day sugar-free challenge, you'll feel clean, empowered, and in control. And Dan DeFigio argues that a simple sugar detox can improve your mental clarity and lead you to a more empowered and fulfilled life. The content of the category of empowerment is unspecified in any of these claims and signals a generalized self-efficacy that's presumed to carry over to all aspects of life. Dan DeFigio, for example, sees giving up sugar as a step towards, quote, creating or improving other positive things in your life, relationships, exercise, career, time management, and self-care. It's also a hyperproductive life, the life without sugar. Paul McKenna promises a reduction in idle thoughts. And for Alan Carr, quote, work will become more enjoyable and you'll become better at what you do. So free from sugar, you make your own luck and the world is your oyster. So bang, as Gillespie says. Tantalizing though they are, there's a tension at the heart of these promised transformations. So on the one hand, claims to simplicity allow for their presentation as verging on miraculous, that you do this simple thing and boom, everything changes. But with just a few days or weeks of struggle, then resolving into this blissful state of appetite control. But on the other hand, the privileged reader is the one who is prepared to take responsibility for their health and body by putting in the work. One way in which this is resolved is through the representation of the transformation as effortless. It's not that there is no work involved, it's that it doesn't feel like work. As cultural sociologist Mickey McGee describes the self-help domain, it's, quote, effortless effort, passive activity, and endless work imagined as effortless exertion. The self of the self-help genre is endlessly, if invisibly, belabored, to use McGee's term, requiring relentless hidden work to create and sustain the newly invented self in the face of its own insufficiencies. There are practical aspects to this work, such as they all tell you to clear out your kitchen cupboards when you decide to give up sugar, and then restock with sugar-free foods at the start of the process, which of course from the outset assumes that you can afford to throw food away and restock your cupboards with food that is more expensive than what you had there in the first place. But there's also the work of self-knowledge in the form of relentless quizzes, journals, and reflexive exercises. The quizzes are situated early in the books, providing opportunities for readers to identify their own deficiencies and symptoms, and therefore as needing the advice which follows. And this draws them into the book and then into an imagined community of readers who are all facing the same challenge, some of which will succeed and then some of which will fail. So, for example, Dan DeFigio offers a series of quizzes under the heading, "What kind of sweet freak are you?" that include physical symptoms, do you get headaches, do you wake up tired, and emotional ones, do you gossip or talk about others behind their backs? Do you feel depressed or hopeless? The quiz options lead readers quickly to the right answer, affirming their need to keep reading, with sugar held culpable for every possible physical, social, and emotional dysfunction. These diagnostic tests give way to further extra textual work that reaches beyond the initial challenge period and aims to equip the reader with the skills to continue their self-invention after finishing the book. The miraculous vanishing of the desire for sweetness, it turns out, is always precarious, and self-knowledge is positioned as the only way to avoid falling back into old habits and behaviours. In this way, the real me, to which the sugar abstainer is presumed to return, is also a new me that requires new skills and insights to fend off the temptations of sugar. So, for example, Jones concludes each chapter with a reflexive exercise under the heading, "What are you thinking?" And this aims to preempt any negative thoughts that might be interfering with the transformation. So, for example, the negative and unhelpful thought that I don't want to make any changes to my schedule, I'm busy enough as it is recast as, I'm willing to do what it takes to succeed, even if it requires initial sacrifice. Being slim and healthy is worth it to me. Concerns about time and capacity are quickly discredited, reducing success to a matter of motivated choice and careful strategies. Another core prescribed activity is journaling. The act of journaling serves multiple purposes and is a staple of the self-help genre more generally. Jones recommends keeping a food and mood journal to identify eating triggers, while for DeFigio, a food journal acts as a lie detector, advising if you bite it, you write it. These journaling tasks expose the limits of the books, which present themselves as the answer to the problem, while at the same time insisting that readers will need to look beyond the books if they are to succeed. The texts appear self-sufficient, but are ultimately insufficient, and the reader ends up being both the problem and the solution, drawn into a process of ongoing labour without end. Furthermore, it's never enough simply to recognise their own failings in the journals, but they have to take recuperative action. Negative thoughts have to be flipped to positive ones, bad eating habits have to be reformed, and constraints in time and money have to be circumvented through smart self-management. And there's a lot to be said about the use of the word smart in this domain. It comes up all the time. These unimaginative and unforgiving prescriptions highlight the way in which the writing tasks offer a prescribed language to ensure that readers remain within the bounds of good dietary citizenship on which the books are premised. But while the preparatory and ongoing work of giving up sugar is addressed in exhaustive and repetitive detail in the books, there is no discussion about who performs this labor of label reading, planning, reflecting, shopping and cooking, which is inescapably coded as the work of women, even amidst the disingenuous gender neutrality of the books. As we saw with the case of Gemma earlier, I spoke about earlier, one way of achieving this is through the recasting of domestic labor as leisure. And this is the effortless effort that McGee talks about. So Paul McKenna gives us a very good example of this. So he says you'll start spending a bit more time finding the right foods, you'll cook differently, you might cook more often, you might spend an extra minute or two peeling fruit and having to wash your hands instead of just opening juice. But when you've established your new routines, it won't seem like effort at all. You might discover that you enjoy it more. The reduction of the labor of going sugar-free to a few moments of fruit peeling and hand washing willfully obscures the extensive time and effort involved. Instead, McKenna articulates a patriarchal fantasy of primarily women's unpaid labor as too pleasurable for it even to be classed as work, while stopping well short of suggesting the redistribution of that labor, or even that this work has somehow brought a new joy to his own life. As Mickey McGee observes of the beloved self, work is reimagined, not as a deprivation for which one ought to be compensated, but as a means of expressing oneself, a source of identity and personal fulfillment. Mobilizing the same logics that see smart money management as a means of getting around financial limitations, as we've seen, for example, in the case of austerity or the cost of living crisis in the UK recently, time, or the lack of it, is equally a matter of careful economies and micro efficiencies that require no structural or fundamental change in the organization of everyday life. Jones, for example, urges readers to create time to succeed. She presents the case of Susan, who we are told Susan, who we're told creates time for her new sugar-free eating plan with some clever problem solving and delegating. She starts getting up 10 minutes earlier to make a healthy packed lunch, and then asked her husband to take over their daughter Amy's bedtime routine on weeknights, which meant she had an extra 15 minutes every evening to plan meals for the next day and make her food shopping list. The microeconomies of finding time mirror those of sugar reduction, where savings are passed by the teaspoon and the gram by the mortified mothers. By finding 10 minutes here and 15 minutes there, she squeezes her new eating plan into the packed day. But this isn't creating time. Instead, the labor of sugar-free food preparation eats into her sleep time. And while the bedtime routine is passed to her husband, the work of delegation still falls to her. And the transfer of the task simply opens up a sliver of time for yet more work. The work of giving up sugar then is not only without end, but also unevenly distributed in ways that allow for its categorization as not work and its dislocation from the uneven social relations and structures that frame everyday work. So some conclusions, and those are the angry sugar cubes that we started from. Sugar is widely conceptualized as an animated threat to health that lurks hidden in our familiar foods. Its effects are not only understood as externally visible, for example, in body fat, but also as hidden internally in the form of unseen metabolic disruption and dysregulated appetite. The normative work of giving up sugar then, in the first instance, is the work of raising the alarm. We see this in the hidden sugar shock genre of news reporting, with exposés designed to shock readers out of apathy and into action. In the wake of these punchy, melodramatic anti-sugar stories, we find the more carefully paced and detailed book-length manuals for becoming a good sugar-free citizen. They're founded on the expectation that the management of food, health, and the body are the responsibility of the individual, and that we make our own luck with the choices that we make and how smartly we navigate our busy days and household budgets. But expert advice is needed to marshal this transformation, and the books brook no excuses. Armed with the necessary information, the winners rise to the challenge while the losers fall by the wayside with the resolutely classed and gendered expectations of this work quietly hidden in the process. Rather than an expression of existing privilege, the sugar-free life becomes a testimony to the willingness of the individual to take control, to exercise control over the body, to defer pleasure, to act on expert advice rather than impulse, and to consume tastefully. In doing so, readers can distance themselves from the feckless, over-consuming other whose objection hangs quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, in the air surrounding every exhortation to transform both the diet and, by extension, the self. For me, this signals the need for new points of departure, far beyond single nutrient prescriptions, since the stories we tell about public health not only set the terms of debate, but demarcate the solutions that we can imagine. If the problem is we are eating too much sugar, the only measure of success is eating less sugar. And that's the only way the interventions can be deemed to be solving the problem. Social inequality and injustice are not incidental or collateral to the attack on sugar, but rather are baked into it from the start. And to leave the task of articulating the problem of sugar to those already best positioned to accrue capital through its repudiation is always to risk sedimenting those inequalities rather than ameliorating them. This points to the need to focus on political choices, not food choices, and on inequalities as failures of social justice and not simply as barriers to be circumvented to get people to eat the right things. In turn, this involves refusing the comforting sense of individual control and self-transformation that comes with sugar restriction in favour of something much more unsettling. Thank you for listening.